Good afternoon, everyone. It's like third session in a row today. So if you feel like you need like a moment to like stand up and stretch or whatever it is, please feel free. Also, the last presenter that I was in, I loved what she said when she started, which is if once I start, you're like, that's not what I thought this was about, or this is not something that interests me, please feel free just to get up and leave. I don't want you to feel like I will be offended. I want everyone to be getting out of this conference, whatever it is that you are hoping to get out of it. So welcome. Just a little bit about myself before I jump into my presentation. I work for an organization in Alberta, Canada called SAGES. Its focus is domestic and sexual violence, with a focus on coercive control. I also am doing my PhD at the University of Salford in Manchester, and most of the findings that I'm going to talk about today are informed by both my PhD as well as my 20+ years in the field as a social worker, even though I am doing my PhD in psychology and did my master's in psychology. So I said this to Sam, I'm very technologically incompetent, but I'm going to do my best to make my way through the slides. Also, I'm pretty informal, so if a question comes up as we're going along, don't feel like you have to wait until the end. So I think that before I begin, it's really important to me that we all have a common working definition of what we mean when we say coercive control. And so I'm going to share with you my working definition. And I would love at some point if people have different working definitions, if they'd like to share them with me, because I'm very curious about that. And so my working definition is that coercive control is an act or a pattern of acts that are used to regulate and dominate another person's life and remove their personal agency. So what do I mean by that? That coercive control is a pattern of acts that stops someone from being able to act in their own best interests. I really like this definition because I think that this definition talks to both the core of the emotional experience as well as it being a human rights issue, because personal agency is a human rights issue. So I just want to frame coercive control a little bit in the context that I think it occurs in. And so the first is I would frame it or I would characterize it. And this is actually a definition created by my PhD supervisors, Rod and Linda Dubrow Marshall. And so they talk about it as the colonization of a person's personality, a total takeover by an abuser. And the abuser can be any type of these abusers. It could be a charismatic leader in a high coercion group, cults, new religions, or charismatic leaders. It can be an abusive relationship, and there are many different types of abusive relationships, or it can be in a political or social movement, which often is hard because there's not one leader or one head, but it's still a colonization by that person's identity by that political or social movement. So things like populism or conspiracy theories or disenfranchisement. So I want to just talk a little bit about the evolution of coercive control, because I've been working in the field for 20+ years, specifically in intimate partner violence, IPV. And I don't think I had any idea exactly what informed all of the parts of intimate partner violence that were actually related to the evolution of different types of coercive control. And so in the 1950s and 60s, scholars sought to explore and understand how compliance is put in place in the absence of violence, right? So it's really easy to understand, I'm going to hit you, you have to do this, therefore you do. But when there's no violence, how does compliance happen? And so there was a question about what is the operalization of coercive control, and it was explored in a variety of contexts, from prisoners of war to victims of cult to victims of intimate partner violence, with each scholar's work building on the previous scholar's work. And so, for example, how many people here work in IPV, intimate partner violence or domestic abuse, and are familiar with the power and control wheel? So that power and control wheel actually comes from Biederman's work, which was with prisoners of war. And so that work is all informed by Biederman, even though it's now used, prisoners of war, even though it's now used in domestic violence contexts. How many people here work with cults and are familiar with Margaret Singer's work? So Margaret Singer's work was actually very influenced by Lifton's work with Chinese re-education programs. And so I think that often, or at least I'm going to talk about myself, I thought that the domestic violence world, that the IPV world had come up with the power control wheel all by themselves, when actually it was informed by another type of coercive control, which gave me this inkling that perhaps coercive control is the same in all contexts. So one of the things that I've noticed in my work, and I talked about how this presentation is informed both by my research and my practice. My practice has shown me that there is a massive siloing of responses for victims of coercive control. So we don't have, a coercive control impact agency. We have a domestic abuse agency. We have a cult agency. We have sexual exploitation, trafficking, child abuse. And so because of that siloing of responses, and often that siloing is a result of funding models, right? So it's the non-profit, industrial complex that's forcing us into that siloing. It makes it often focused on episodic and narrow interventions that are very limited, right? So I can only give you this many sessions and only for this topic. The measures are often too limited and too narrow. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the measurements that are available to measure whether there's the presence of coercive control, but they're intimate partner violence measures, or they're cultic measures. They're not universal measures. And I talked about how the social service sector is its own industrial complex, and that has a lot to do with the history of how we came about, and I'm not going to go into that. But I did write an article about it, and if you're interested, I can share it with you. And of course, for me, at the end of the day, it's about the voices of those with lived experience. And what I have heard from the clients that I work with and the clients in the agency that I work with. So our agency is an Alberta-wide agency. We see about 600 clients a year, and I've been there for 20 years. So you can only imagine how many clients we've seen coming through the door. And I can tell you that all of the clients express resonance with coercive control as what's happening to them. They come in because of domestic abuse. But it's not the only experience they're having. They often have domestic abuse and a history of child abuse, or domestic abuse and sexual exploitation, or domestic abuse and intersections with conflict with the law or large systems. And so they express a lot of frustration with the silo and talk about how it doesn't meet their needs. So I want to talk a little bit about the context of coercive control. Sorry, I'm just going to watch the context of coercive control. So these contexts come both from the research that I did. So as part of my PhD, I did an integrative research review where I looked at all of the contexts in which coercive control shows up in scholarly research. I also looked at gray literature, as well as did a bit of a snowballing to try and determine where else it was showing up. And I also looked at popular discourse, because I'm sure many of you are familiar. There is just an explosion recently of, on Netflix, about documentaries about all sorts of different types of coercive control, whether it's Dirty John, that's about domestic abuse, or whether it's all of these cult mini, documentaries that are showing up. But there's an explosion of it. And also, I feel like every person I know who's under the age of 20 uses gaslighting every fifth word, right? And if not gaslighting, then they use narcissism, right? So it's really showing up in our public discourse. So my findings are both from that, as well as from interviews as part of the second part of my PhD, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but interviews with service providers who talked about the context in which they work and the context in which they see coercive control in their practice. So these quotes are from the research. So the first, which was a little bit surprising to me, was workplace. So there's not very much, actually, I would say no scholarly research right now on coercive control in workplace. But interestingly enough, scholars in coercive control are writing or blogging about seeing it in workplaces. So for example, Lisa Aronson Fontes, who wrote a book called Invisible Chains about domestic abuse and coercive control. And she's a professor at the University, I believe, of Massachusetts, somewhere over in that area. She has written a whole series of blogs about coercive control in the workplace, but she hasn't written anything scholarly or peer-reviewed about it. But it exists in workplaces, every organization. One of the other areas was sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, and sexual abuse. I'm sure this is surprising to nobody, but this is a quote from one of the participants. Once they get into that coercive control of getting tied into a pimp or getting their things taken away from them, that becomes a really big piece of where they're not leaving. Although their bodies are getting abused and they're not living a healthy lifestyle, but they won't leave because they feel like they're underneath that coercive control where they're owned by someone else. So this is a fairly common and obvious one. Domestic abuse and dating violence. I've worked with people who are involved within domestic abuse too, because the model of coercive control fits with them. Gangs and organized crime. I think we often don't think about people who are in gangs as actual victims of coercive control. We just think about them as perpetrators, but they are victims of coercive control. Coercive control and other aspects of law enforcement, like organized crime, or that sort of thing, like drug trafficking, right? So often people who are in gangs, especially people who are indoctrinated into gangs as young men, that is a form of coercive control, both in terms of the experience of the gang, but often the society also in which they live. They don't have many other options than to become indoctrinated into a gang. And I use that language purposefully because we use that language with cults, but we don't use it with gangs. Oops, sorry. Cults and high coercion groups, well, that's why we're all here today. Religious and spiritual contexts, right? And so this is actually a quote from a religious leader that I interviewed. And yet I felt she was trying to have me as the clergy come as an instrument to help continue the control and coercion of other people in the family. Child abuse. This is also an obvious one. People have been victims of parental alienation, and individuals who are in things like the troubled teen industry, which uses similar techniques. Although they're incarcerated, they're first incarcerated physically and then incarcerated mentally. I'm really actually disappointed. I'm glad that you're all here, but I'm disappointed I can't go to, I think it's Phil Engel's presentation on teens in the troubled teen industry. Because I think it is an area of coercive control that we don't understand or name that way. It's a large system coercive control. It's also, there's some, I think a few documentaries on Netflix about it as well. Large systems, the use of court systems to try and intimidate her or him or whomever, but that's not the only type of large system, right? For people who don't live in countries that have freedom, right? There's also often large system coercive control. And then of course, there's the cultural contexts. One of the participants said, I think a lot of things were framed as cultural that later were understood to be coercive and control. Does anyone have any questions so far? I don't know why I keep doing that. Sorry. So there are lots of co-occurrences of coercive control and lots of similarities. And so I love this quote from one of the participants. Okay, parallels of all of this is that once you know one, if I may say Martian, you know the group. And so what this participant essentially was trying to say was, if someone has experienced coercive control in one area, often what happens to them is the cogs in the, start going off and they start thinking, wait, I'm being coercively controlled in this aspect of my life. I've actually experienced the same thing over here, and that's also coercive control. But what we force people into is, I'm only going to be here to talk to you about the domestic violence, even though learning about coercive control and domestic violence has brought up for you the fact that you also are a victim of child abuse and coercive control. That's not what we're here to talk about, right? I'm going to sort of open Pandora's box of understanding for you, but then not allow you to talk about it. Or I'm going to send you in another agency to do so, which means you're going to have to go to lots of different places instead of understanding you as an integrated person. So I just want to talk a little bit about the measures of coercive control that exist. And before I go into the measures, I just want to talk about the fact that when I did my research with the practitioners who work with people who experience coercive control and asked them about the measures that they used, mostly so, even if they were using measures, they said to me, I just have a felt sense of it. I know it when I see it. And so I think it's really interesting that so many participants talked about having a felt sense of knowing about coercive controlling behaviors or parts of coercive control for the people that they're working with. I'm not sure exactly yet what that says about the measures that are existing, but I think it's very interesting. The other interesting thing is once I dug a little deeper and said, well, Where does that felt sense come from? Then they started to describe the behaviors. So the kind of behaviors that they described was when decision-making is impacted or taken away, faith-based control, threats, harassment, stalking, disempowerment, and isolation. Very rarely did anyone mention as a measure of coercive control physical violence, partly because it's an obvious one, but partly because it doesn't exist in most cases, right? In terms of domestic violence, there's usually no physical violence involved in domestic violence, right? Less than 30% in Canada of people who experience domestic abuse experience physical violence, right? Cults also, there's not often physical violence. There's the threat of it possibly, but there isn't physical violence. And the measures, well, there's so many of them. And even if they're researched and even if they're proven to be bad measures, people are still using them, right? So for example, and with all due respect to the ODARA, which is the Ontario Domestic Abuse Risk Assessment, I think that those are the words. The ODARA has been extensively researched and proved to not be a good measurement tool, but most domestic violence agencies in Ontario are still using it. I'm not so sure about why that is. I think it's because social workers and agencies are overwhelmed and don't have time to engage in the research. We buy into a tool, we get trained on the tool, and we just keep using the tool. So there's all of these tools. I'm not really going to go through them. I'm just going to say that there is one tool that I am a big proponent of, which is the SAGES high conflict screening tool, which is of course a tool that we developed, my organization developed, and the reason I'm a big proponent of it is because it's actually a tool that is only administered by social workers, and it's administered in a narrative way, because a big part of identifying domestic abuse is narrative, and a big part of identifying coercive control, because it's not about the actions, it's about the experience and the impacts of the actions. Right. So it's really important if someone has a partner that shows up every day at work and brings them flowers, that could be an act of respect and love, or it could also be an act of control. And so it's really important that whatever the tool is measures that, right? So I don't want to know if you're showing up every day with flowers. I want to know the experience of the individual of that action. So I'm going to talk about 2 case studies because I think that that's the best way to describe also for me, it's the most interesting way. So the first one I want to talk about is Sam. So this is not really a picture of Sam because confidentiality, and Sam is not really Sam's name. So Sam came into our agency, and Sam came into our agency because Sam's partner was abusive. And there was a series of episodes of coercive control that finally actually did lead to some sort of violence. As a result of that violence, Sam's partner was sent to jail. Not for a long time, but Sam's partner was sent to jail, leaving Sam Sam didn't have any of Sam's own income. They didn't have their own income. Their partner was the main source of income. So leaving Sam and the children with no income while the partner was in jail. So Sam had full intentions of reuniting with their partner when their partner got out of jail. So this was not we've split up, my partner's gone to jail. This was I feel like I'm not, Sam, I'm sorry. Sam's sitting over here. So Sam had every intention to be back with their partner. So Sam was maintaining the relationship with their partner while their partner was in jail. Sam's partner also, the income that was coming to the family happened to be coming through, I'll call it ill-gotten gains. Sam's partner was a member of a gang. Sam's partner was a drug trafficker and a weapons trafficker. And so that was how the money was coming in. So Sam went to their partner and said, what are we going to do for money while you're in jail? And Sam's partner said, well, you're going to go to my boss, who was in the gang, but you're going to go to my boss and you're going to do whatever my boss tells you to do. And we'll go from there. And Sam said, but if I do something illegal and I also go to jail, what's going to happen to our kids? And the partner said, it doesn't matter, you have to do it. And because there had been so much coercive control in the relationship, and because Sam was not out of the relationship, Sam agreed to do it. So Sam went to the boss of their partner, and the boss started with, I want you just to go to a bar and give these few pills to this person who I tell you to give them to. Not great, but Sam was like, okay, this is a little thing. I can do this and I'm not so afraid of being caught. Eventually it escalated to the point that Sam's partner's boss, AKA the person who was in the gang above him, said, I need you to start turning tricks. So Sam did not want to do this. Sam went to their partner and said, I don't want to start turning tricks. For those of you that are not English speakers, that means getting involved in sex work, becoming a prostitute. Sam said, I don't want to do that. And Sam's partner said, you have no choice. And so Sam felt they had no choice. And so Sam did. So now Sam is experiencing coercive control at the hand of their partner. So in that context, they are now involved in a gang against their will because of their partner. So now they're in a gang and they're also being sexually exploited. Well, of course, Sam ended up in conflict with the law, right? So in Canada, it is not there. It's very kind of hazy about whether or not it's illegal to sell yourself in order to, like, sex work is kind of like hazy, but drug trafficking is not. And so Sam actually got picked up for drug trafficking. It was a very small amount, but Sam got picked up for drug trafficking. And then because they like to pile it on, they piled on some things regarding prostitution. And now Sam is in conflict with the law, and Sam is in conflict with a large system that doesn't understand that the reason that Sam was in conflict with the law was because of coercive control. So there are these multiple contexts, right? And Sam is involved with our agency, domestic abuse, right? So that's one context. We've siloed Sam. Sam is involved with another agency called the Elizabeth Fry Society in Canada. That's for women that are in conflict with the law. Sam is involved with another agency, which is a specific trafficking agency, because the gang traffics Sam across different provinces. Now it's trafficking. And so or Sam has lots of different people in their life, nobody who's helpful, including us, I would say, because we're not dealing with the underlying issue of coercive control. And so that is, I think, some of those experiences that we see that are multi-contextual experiences, co-occurrences of coercive control that the system doesn't acknowledge. I don't have an answer. What happened to Sam eventually was Sam served a very short period of time in jail. During that time, Sam's children actually went into a kinship care, which is to a family member. And when Sam got out of jail, Sam got back their kids. And when Sam's partner got out of jail, Sam returned to them, and they are still together, and there's still domestic abuse. And nothing has changed, except for Sam is no longer turning tricks. They're no longer involved in sex work because they don't need to be. But I don't think that we've dealt with anything, right? I'm sure that we're going to see Sam again in the system. So this is another case story. I want to talk about Mark. For those of you that were in the mental health practitioner circle yesterday, Mark was the case that I brought up. So I apologize for bringing up the case again, but essentially Mark was a member of an insular Christian community. And that insular Christian community, there was sexual abuse. There was coercive control, not sexual abuse of Mark, sexual abuse of Mark's sister by one of the leaders of the community. Mark's parents knew about the sexual abuse of Mark's sister and didn't do anything about it because of their belief that the leader of that group was entitled for religious reasons to perpetrate that coercive control. So Mark's parents were victims of coercive control also. Mark did nothing about any of this in his life. Mark got married also to someone from that community. In that community, education is not supported, so Mark never really went past grade 8. And so Mark didn't have much possibility of having a good job. So of course, Mark worked for someone in the community, which is how Mark's living was. And then it all went south. And the community was, the sexual abuse that had happened to Mark's sister had happened to many girls in the community. And there was an investigation, and criminal and civil criminal charges were brought against the leaders of the community, and civil charges were brought by the victims of the community. So now Mark was confronted with having to deal with the religious coercion that he had grown up with feeling guilty about his sister. And because Mark had grown up in this very insular religious community with very insular values that were very hierarchical, Mark was also struggling in his own relationship with his wife. And Mark and his wife had mutual couples conflict. So there was domestic violence happening, but it was very mutual. The reason that Mark came to our agency was because the police had been called to their house numerous times. There was not physical violence involved. So there was no criminal charges that were laid, but a lawyer had suggested to Mark that it would probably be a good idea for him to go and get some counseling just in case charges were laid so that he could say that he's trying to deal with his issue. So Mark came into our agency. So there's not a lot that's motivating Mark to be with us, right? But as we started to unpeel the layers, right, or as we're unpeeling the layers, what we're recognizing is that there are these and what Mark is recognizing, there's multiple layers of coercive control. There's intimate partner violence. There's, I'm going to call it the cult that he grew up in and that he's still sort of in and can't really exit because he has no capacity to make money without working for this member of the cult. And because he has no education. And he's also, I'm going to say, being coercively controlled by his boss. And so those are all of the co-occurring contexts. And the only one that Mark is really getting help with is, of course, the domestic violence one, because that's the service that's being offered to him. So, Mark, I don't have an answer for you. I'll let you know. But I think we're failing people. I think we're failing them miserably. And I say that as the CEO of a domestic violence organization that's fairly large and has a lot of capacity, but we also have these limitations because of our funding and because of how people think about this issue. But hopefully that's changing. So I want to talk about what's going on emotionally for people like Sam and what's going on emotionally for people like Mark. And these are actually happening for, I think, anyone, and that's what the research says, anyone who's experiencing coercive control. So PTS, depression, disassociation, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, sorry. Cognitive and executive functioning are negatively impacted. There's lots of self-esteem and shame. Self-efficacy and help-seeking are negatively impacted. There's a lot of existential and spiritual trauma that's experienced. There's lots of attachment risk and protective factors that are not being addressed, right? So some of the risk factors are things like their gender, their age, the history of trauma, unstable mental health, a tenuous relational arena, the intersection of all of these risk factors, economic and societal challenges, the naivety of the individual in the socio-ecological arenas. So there's a lot of push-pull factors into coercive control, and of course, the exacerbation of pre-existing mental health issues. This is a very long list, and I'm sure it surprises nobody. So my question is, if all of the clients from all of our different areas that we work in, domestic abuse, sexual exploitation, cults, gangs, extremist groups, if they're all experiencing these things, why are we talking about the what happened, who did the thing to you versus the impact that you're experiencing? So one of the really interesting things for me from the research that I did is when I spoke to practitioners, and I spoke to practitioners who are lawyers, who are police officers, who are clergy, who are therapists, social workers. So I spoke to a variety of different practitioners in a variety of different areas. One of the things that they all said was, with the exception of one, nobody walks into my office and says, I need help with coercive control. What they do is they walk into my office and say, I feel really depressed. Or I feel like I'm, got some cognitive and executive functioning. And they don't say it that way. They say, I can't make decisions. I'm having a hard time, right? They talk about self-esteem and shame, right? Some people talk about existential trauma, right? Like the meaning of life. What's it all for? Why did this happen to me? And what's really interesting is whether it's a police officer, a family law lawyer, or a therapist, the clients are all saying the same thing when they walk in. And so I think that we should be talking to people from this perspective. What happened to you? Not who did it to you. It's the same problem with the law, right? Laws all are about who did this to you because they want to hold the perpetrator accountable, not what happened to you. By the way, I think that we can upload this to the Wahova app afterwards so people can get the PowerPoint. So don't feel, I'm happy to share it. So these are some commonly noted interventions that exist for coercive control. And here's the interesting thing as well. It doesn't matter what kind of practitioner you are or what field you work in, everybody's using the same interventions. And so there are things like psychoeducational. Everybody is using psychoeducational interventions. Everybody, lawyers, doctors. You were the GP yesterday who was talking about that. That was great, right? Lawyers, doctors, therapists, social workers, police officers. Everybody's using psychoeducational interventions, and that's usually the place that they start. Ideological interventions, so those are meaning-making interventions, right? How do you understand what happened to you? What is the meaning behind it, and where's the meaning in life? Eclectic interventions, a little bit of everything, right? Peer-based, that's a very large piece of work that's happening across all areas. Collaborative approaches, so I heard a lot of, I don't know how to do this thing, so I refer them out to someone who does, right? So there's a lot of collaboration happening, and also a lot of making sure that there's safety, emotional safety, physical safety, right? All of those safety pieces. There are justice system interventions, both civil and criminal. Some of them work, some of them don't. Most of the criminal interventions, with the exception of France, are all intimate partner violence focused, and the civil are all across the board. So these are my conclusions and my recommendations. So I think that we need to acknowledge and respond to co-occurrences of coercive control in different contexts. So one of the things that I find shocking, and that I don't know why I didn't think about it before, but years ago, when probably about 15 years ago, when working in domestic violence, we said to ourselves, maybe we should be asking the women who come into this agency if they also have experiences of sex work or sexual exploitation. And everyone was like, nah, mostly so they're not going to have it. It's not going to be an issue. Well, we started asking and found that about 70 to 90%, depending on who the clients were, had experiences of sexual exploitation. So we also define those sexual exploitation as trading sex for safety or for housing, those sort of things, right? So most women who have experienced domestic abuse have also traded sex for safety. So there's sexual exploitation there. But we never asked the question, and we didn't think it existed. So one of the things after doing this research that I went to my staff and I said is, how many of our clients do you think have other contexts that they're experiencing coercive control in? And the person who's in charge of our clinical services said, I have no idea. We've never asked the question. Right? How have I been doing all this work and we never asked the question in my practice? And so that's one of the things that we're going to start doing. So we need to acknowledge the co-occurrences and even ask about them. We need to break down the silos. We need to develop common measures, both formal and informal, and ideally common measures that are not just accepted therapeutically, but are also accepted legally. We need to develop commonality in our interventions. And we also, I think, need further research into the experiences of co-occurrence. And I'm going to talk about that. So as I mentioned, I'm doing my PhD. I'm into my third year, and I just received ethics for the third year of my PhD. And what I'm hoping to do is this work, is to look into the commonalities. So I am hoping that I can interview individuals with lived experience of coercive control in more than one context. So co-occurrences. So this is actually a QR code that will link you to a Google form, not a Google, a Microsoft form that will tell you more about the research. It's a participant information sheet. It also, if you're interested, will allow you to sign up to be a participant in the research. I apologize. I have to use Microsoft Forms because of the university ethics. It is not a great platform. You have to do a lot of like next. So I apologize right now for the clunkiness of the form. I had to use that, but please, if you have the patience, click next and make your way all the way through the participant information form to find out more about the study. And then if you either yourself are interested and it's applicable to you, and or you have clients or patients who you think might be interested, I would love if you would share the information. I also have some posters that you can take with the QR code. I apologize, the edge of the poster got cut off because they printed it at the hotel last night. But really all that matters is the QR code. So, that is the next piece of research for me, is to understand. And so I want to understand, are there co-occurrences, and when there are co-occurrences, how did you figure it out for yourself that there was a co-occurrence? Did you learn about it in one part of your life and then, realize that it was happening in another part? Where did you go for help? And how was that help for you? Did you get what you needed? And so this is how you can get in touch with me, or if you want to learn more about Sagesse, this is how you can learn more about it, another QR code. And that's pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions?